She looked me dead in the eyes in her white silk dress, makeup flawless, nails done, guests clapping around us, and said, "Louis, stop joking. Why would you think I'm the bride?" I stood at the altar, ring box in my hand, heart beating, like it was about to tear through my chest, and said, "I'm not joking." She smiled, laughed. But it wasn't nervous laughter. It was cruel. The kind of laugh someone gives when they know they've won. She stepped back, still smiling, and said, "You're serious? Oh my God, this is embarrassing." Then she picked up a glass of water from the table and poured it slowly over my head. No screaming, no shouting, just a cold, humiliating stream right in front of my family, her parents, and 200 guests. And just like that, she walked away from the aisle, heels tapping against the marble, leaving me dripping, with nothing but the sound of whispers following me like shadows. But what she didn't realize was that she had walked into the wrong ceremony. Because this wedding was never meant for her, and that white silk dress she wore, it wasn't even hers. She had shown up thinking I was desperate, thinking I'd cave, thinking I still wanted her, but that ring in my hand was never meant for Tomika. No. That was for someone else. Someone who had stood quietly in the back all this time. Someone who once told me, "You deserve to be chosen, not tolerated." Someone who never made me beg to be loved. Someone named Kathleen. But Tomika didn't know that yet. Not until the music started again, and the real bride walked in. And by then, she was too far from the aisle, too far from the truth, and far, far too late. My name is Louis, and for the last 3 years, I thought I was building a future with Tomika. She was everything I thought I wanted: smart, beautiful, driven, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone else feel like background noise. When we first met, she was working at a branding agency, and I was freelancing, trying to turn my side hustle into something stable. She helped me redesign my pitch decks, taught me how to talk like I belonged in boardrooms, pushed me to aim higher, and I did. Because of her, I landed my first big retainer client. Because of her, I started believing I deserved more. I fell fast, and I fell hard. I'd never met someone who made ambition look so effortless. She'd sip her coffee and casually talk about her 5-year plan, as if the world had already agreed to it. I used to joke that she didn't chase dreams. She scheduled them. And back then, she would just smile, lean her head on my shoulder and say, "You're part of that plan too, Louis, just don't slow me down." At first, everything was easy. Late-night work sessions, weekend brunches with her friends, quiet. Dinners at my place when she was too tired to talk. I didn't mind. I liked being the calm to her chaos, the silence to her storm. But as time passed, the balance started to feel less like love and more like performance. We never fought about big things. It was always small. Me asking if she'd be home by 9, and her rolling her eyes like I was trying to control her. Me bringing up the idea of moving in, and her saying she wasn't ready to merge closets. Even when I asked about marriage, I didn't ask like I was demanding it. I asked with hope, like maybe, just maybe, she'd say, "Yes, let's start planning." But every time she'd shut it down with a smile. A soft pat on the hand, a distracted kiss, and that line she used over and over again. "Not now. You know I've got goals, Louis. Be patient with me." So I was patient. For 1 year. Then 2. Then into the 3rd. By then I had my own agency. Clients that kept me busy. A condo that didn't feel like a bachelor pad anymore. But a home. A home I pictured her in. Cooking. Laughing. Maybe one day holding our kid in her arms. But no matter how far I came, I always felt like I was chasing her shadow. Like I had to keep proving that I was worthy. I thought it was just her being cautious. I didn't realize she was slowly rewriting our story from forever to for now. The first real crack appeared on our 3rd anniversary. I'd booked a private dinner, rented a rooftop garden, had a custom ring box made with her initials, not for a proposal, just to show her I was serious. But when she arrived, she barely looked around. Her first words were, "Is this why you asked me to dress up? I have a meeting at 9 a.m. I laughed it off. She didn't. The entire dinner, she was on her phone, texting, checking her calendar, pausing only to sigh at the menu prices. When dessert came, I slid the small velvet box toward her. Her eyes didn't light up. They narrowed. "Louis, if this is what I think it is, it's not a ring," I said quickly. "It's just a promise that I'm still here, that I want this." She looked at the box, then at me, then back at her phone, and said, "You're sweet, but this is a lot right now." I told myself she was just overwhelmed, that it wasn't rejection, just bad timing. But late that night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her crying in the bathroom. Soft, quiet sobs. I waited, thinking she'd come out, crawl into bed, and tell me what was wrong. She didn't. She cried until morning. I never asked her about it. But weeks later, I saw the name on her phone flashing again and again during dinner. Rick, the ex who meant nothing, but apparently still meant enough to make her cry behind a locked door. Asked her once if she still talked to him. She didn't lie, didn't even hesitate. "Yeah, we're still friends. Don't be insecure, Louis. You know I chose you." But did she? Every part of me was tied to her. Every hope, every plan, every vision of the future. But she never looked at me like I was the destination. I was just the convenience store on her highway, good for now, but never where she planned to stay. Still, I held on. Because when you love someone that deeply, you ignore the signs. The late replies, the changed tone, the way their hugs feel shorter, colder. You start blaming yourself, thinking maybe if you earn a little more, work a little less, say the right things, maybe she'll come around. But love shouldn't feel like a negotiation. And by the time I realized that, I was already standing at the altar, ring in hand, staring at a woman who didn't want to be chosen because she never believed I was worth choosing. It was supposed to be a simple dinner. Just me, Tomika, her parents, and mine, a chance to finally bring our families together, lay the groundwork for something real. I thought she'd see the effort, the floral arrangements, the table reservation, even the menu specially crafted, with all her favorite dishes. I thought she'd walk in, see our parents talking and smiling, and realize this was it. This was home. But she showed up late, 38 minutes late. Not a text, not a call. Just the sound of her heels clicking down the restaurant floor and the flash of her phone still in her hand as she slid into the seat beside me without even saying hello. Her mother asked gently, "Long day at work, sweetie?" Tomika barely looked up. I had a shoot. We ran over. Then Rick called. Rick, again. I didn't react, not on my face, but I felt it, like a nail scraping down the back of my throat. I clenched my fingers under the table and smiled. Her dad laughed politely. "The photographer guy, right? Still friends, huh?" "Yeah," Tomika said, casually sipping her water. "He knows me better than anyone." I stared at the tablecloth, watching a small droplet of condensation slide down her glass like it was the only thing that made sense anymore. My father shifted in his chair. "So, Louis," he said, trying to change the subject. "Any updates on the business expansion? Your mom says you're looking into a second office." I nodded. "Yeah, it's coming along. Just closed with 2 new clients last week." "Look at that," Tomika's mom smiled. "Sounds like a man who's ready to settle down." That's when it happened. Tomika turned her head slowly, looked at me and laughed, a sharp, uncomfortable sound that made even the waiter flinch. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Oh my God, Louis, you didn't bring both our families here just to pressure me into marrying you, did you?" The table fell silent. I blinked. The words hung in the air, thick like fog before a storm. My mother looked down. My father's jaw clenched. Her parents exchanged glances, too polite to say what their eyes already screamed. I whispered, "Tomika, it's just dinner." But she wasn't done, she scoffed. "You've been weird for weeks. You think if you drag my parents into this, I'll say yes out of guilt? That's pathetic, Louis." I looked at her, truly looked. And for the first time in years, I didn't recognize the woman sitting beside me. She stood up, took her cloth, napkin and tossed it onto her plate. You want someone to play house with you? Find someone else. I'm not some girl you can lock down in a kitchen. She grabbed her bag, looked around the table, and smiled. Sorry, everyone. I've got places to be. Then she reached for the untouched glass of water, lifted it slowly, and poured it down, straight onto my lap. The entire room gasped. Someone dropped a fork in the corner. My mother's breath hitched. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat there dripping, silent, watching her walk away like I was nothing more than a stain to be rinsed off. The silence after she left was louder than anything she'd said. My father eventually cleared his throat. Son. I stood up, patted my soaked trousers, and said softly, Excuse me. I didn't look at anyone. Not my mom. Not her parents. Not even the waiter who nervously offered me a towel as I walked past. Outside, the night air hit me like a slap. Cold, uncaring, just like her. I sat on the curb, staring at the lights of passing cars, and pulled out the velvet box from my coat pocket. It was still there. Still unopened. Still meant for someone, but not for her. Not anymore. What she didn't know was that this entire dinner, this whole setup, was never about getting her to say yes. I had already let her go in my heart 2 weeks ago, when I found the messages between her and Rick. They weren't just catching up, they were planning trips, sharing late-night photos, inside jokes, the kind of things you only send to someone you wish you'd never left. I'd confronted her. She said it was harmless, that I was overreacting, that Rick was just a friend who understood her better. And maybe he did. But that wasn't the part that broke me. What broke me was when I asked her, if you love him more, just say it. And she said, I love you both differently. Is that a crime? That was the moment I realized. I had spent 3 years loving a woman who couldn't even choose me in a 2-person relationship. So I didn't come to that dinner to propose. I came to end it with grace, to let her bow out with dignity, to give her one last moment to look like the woman I used to believe in, but instead she chose humiliation. She chose chaos. She chose a grand exit from a stage she never earned, and while she walked out thinking she won, thinking she'd made her point, she didn't realize one thing. The bride hadn't even arrived yet. I sat in my car for almost an hour watching the water soak deeper into my pants, feeling it chill my skin but not doing a thing about it. The velvet box sat on the passenger seat, still unopened, still untouched. Every few minutes I glanced at it, like it might change shape, like it might grow legs, walk out of the car and go find someone else who deserved it. But it just sat there, silent, like me. I didn't cry. Not then. Think I'd cried all my tears a long time ago, quietly, in the small moments. Like when she'd roll over and fall asleep while I was still talking, or when she'd scroll through Instagram during our anniversary dinner, or when she forgot my mother's birthday, even though I reminded her twice. That's when the tears came, not now. Now, there was only stillness. It's strange how pain doesn't always feel like knives. Sometimes it's just silence, an empty inbox, a dinner reservation never confirmed. The pause after you say, I love you, and don't hear it back. For weeks, I'd been rehearsing what I would say to her. If I ever got the courage, if I ever truly let go, I imagined telling her everything. How it felt being the second choice, how much it hurt watching her light up at Rick's messages, how humiliating it was to be the one always giving, always understanding, always forgiving. But in the end, I didn't say a word. She threw water on me in front of everyone, and I just took it, like I always took everything from her. Quietly. I turned the key in the ignition but didn't drive. I just sat there listening to the low hum of the engine, watching headlights pass one after another, like time itself was daring me to move on. Part of me still hoped she would call, just to say sorry. Even if it was forced, even if it didn't mean anything, I would have taken it. Because sometimes closure is the only gift you're still begging for, even when you know you'll never get it. But she didn't call. Not that night, not the next day. Not ever. and maybe that silence was the loudest answer I ever got from her. The next morning, I looked around my apartment and saw little pieces of her everywhere. A hair clip on the nightstand, her perfume still lingering in the hallway, a mug she never finished her coffee from. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the ceramic, then set it back down. Just as full, just as cold. That day, I packed everything that reminded me of her into 2 boxes, one for things she might want back, and one for things I would never touch again. When I got to the second box, I hesitated. Inside was a photo strip of us, taken 2 years ago in a mall photo booth. Our faces squished together, eyes laughing, like we hadn't already started breaking. I stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, I folded it in half. Then, in half again, until the ink cracked and her smile disappeared between the creases. I tossed it into the trash. Not because I hated her, but because I knew if I didn't, I'd keep looking at it, hoping it would remind me of something worth saving. That night, I got a message. Not from her, from someone else. Kathleen. She didn't say much, just one sentence. I saw what happened, that's all, but it was enough to pull the breath out of my lungs. Kathleen had always been there, just on the edges. Never too close, never too far. A friend, a listener, a quiet presence who never needed attention, but always seemed to know when I was hurting. She once told me, "Some people love loud and bright, others love soft and steady. One fades fast, the other stays." I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, then finally typed back, "I didn't think anyone saw," she replied a moment later. "I always did." That's when the tears came, not because of Tameka, but because I realized someone had been watching me fall apart quietly, patiently, waiting for me to see her. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone, but I also didn't feel ready. Not for anything. Not for a new start, not for a new chapter, not even for a simple reply that might lead to something more. I was still bleeding, still standing in the middle of what Tameka had left behind, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to chase after someone who didn't want to stay. I put my phone down, walked to the window and opened it. The cold air hit my face, but it felt clean, like something had finally passed. The city didn't care about my heartbreak, but somehow, the quiet outside felt kinder than she ever was. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to myself like a promise only I needed to hear. She doesn't get to break me twice. 2 days later, I got an invitation in the mail. It wasn't addressed in Tameka's handwriting, and for a moment, I thought it was a cruel prank. But when I opened it, my chest tightened. The card was cream-colored, the lettering elegant, embossed, in gold. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Rick Harmon and Tameka Ray." I read it once, then again. My eyes scanned the names, the date, the venue. No mistake, no joke. It was real. Now there was only stillness. It's strange how pain doesn't always feel like knives. Sometimes it's just silence. An empty inbox. A dinner reservation never confirmed. The pause after you say, "I love you," and don't hear it back. For weeks, I'd been rehearsing what I would say to her. If I ever got the courage, if I ever truly let go, I imagined telling her everything. How it felt being the second choice, how much it hurt watching her light up at Rick's messages, how humiliating it was to be the one always giving, always understanding, always forgiving. But in the end, I didn't say a word. She threw water on me in front of everyone, and I just took it, like I always took everything from her. Quietly, I turned the key in the ignition but didn't drive. I just sat there listening to the low hum of the engine, watching headlights pass one after another, like time itself was daring me to move on. Part of me still hoped she would call, just to say sorry, even if it was forced. Even if it didn't mean anything, I would have taken it. because sometimes closure is the only gift you're still begging for, even when you know you'll never get it. But she didn't call. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. And maybe that silence was the loudest answer I ever got from her. The next morning, I looked around my apartment and saw little pieces of her everywhere. A hair clip on the nightstand, her perfume still lingering in the hallway, a mug she never finished her coffee from. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the ceramic, then set it back down. Just as full, just as cold. That day, I packed everything. That reminded me of her into 2 boxes. One for things she might want back, and one for things I would never touch again. When I got to the second box, I hesitated. Inside was a photo strip of us, taken 2 years ago in a mall photo booth. Our faces squished together, eyes laughing, like we hadn't already started breaking. I stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, I folded it in half. Then in half again, until the ink cracked and her smile disappeared between the creases. I tossed it into the trash, not because I hated her, but because I knew if I didn't, I'd keep looking at it, hoping it would remind me of something worth saving. That night, I got a message. Not from her, from someone else. Kathleen. She didn't say much, just one sentence. I saw what happened, that's all. But it was enough to pull the breath out of my lungs. Kathleen had always been there, just on the edges, never too close, never too far, a friend, a listener, a quiet presence who never needed attention but always seemed to know when I was hurting. She once told me, "Some people love loud and bright, others love soft and steady. One fades fast, the other stays." I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, then finally typed back, "I didn't think anyone saw." She replied a moment later, "I always did." That's when the tears came. Not because of Tomeka, but because I realized someone had been watching me fall apart quietly, patiently, waiting for me to see her. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone, but I also didn't feel ready. Not for anything. Not for a new start, not for a new chapter, not even for a simple reply that might lead to something more. I was still bleeding, still standing in the middle of what Tomeka had left behind. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to chase after someone who didn't want to stay. I put my phone down, walked to the window and opened it. The cold air hit my face, but it felt clean, like something had finally passed. The city didn't care about my heartbreak, but somehow the quiet outside felt kinder than she ever was. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to myself like a promise only I needed to hear, "She doesn't get to break me twice." 2 days later, I got an invitation in the mail. It wasn't addressed in Tomeka's handwriting, and for a moment, I thought it was a cruel prank. But when I opened it, my chest tightened. The card was cream-colored, the lettering elegant, embossed, in gold. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Rick Harmon and Tomeka Ray." I read it once, then again. My eyes scanned the names, the date, the venue. No mistake, no joke. It was real. From across the room, I saw Rick, standing near the altar, laughing with one of his groomsmen. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who had already won. He had no idea that the woman he was about to marry used to come home to me with that same tired smile, that same perfume, and the same lies tucked under her coat. But it didn't matter anymore. He could have her. He could have the late replies, the constant phone calls, the emotional shutdowns. He could wake up to her silence, go to bed with her distraction. She wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Then I saw her. Tomeka. She stepped out of the suite, draped in white, veil pinned perfectly, heels tapping against the floor like she was walking on clouds made of glass. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, maybe out of habit, maybe for reassurance. And then she saw me. Our eyes locked, for just a second. Long enough for her to blink, long enough for the color to drain from her face, long enough for her to know. I came, her smile faltered. Only a little, But I saw it. She whispered something to the woman next to her, probably a bridesmaid, probably nothing, and kept walking toward the aisle. The ceremony began. The music swelled. People stood. Rick beamed. I remained where I was, leaning against. A marble column in the back, the officiant began. Talked about love and unity and choosing each other every day. It sounded nice, polished, fake. Then he said, "If anyone here believes these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." A beat of silence. I felt everyone's breath pause, but no one said a word, not even me, because this wasn't my story anymore. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Tears were shed. Cheers erupted as Rick kissed the bride. People clapped. I didn't. I just stood there watching them smile, knowing that somewhere under all that white was the same girl who once said, "I'm not ready." But she wasn't afraid of commitment. She was afraid of committing to me. As the guests began to move toward the reception hall, I turned, ready to leave, ready to disappear quietly, the way I had arrived. Then a voice behind me, soft, uncertain, said, "Lewis." I turned slowly. Tamika stood there, still in her dress, her veil pulled back, lipstick slightly smudged, hands shaking around the bouquet. "You came," she said, almost like it surprised her. I did. "Why?" She stepped closer, eyes darting to make sure no one was watching. "Why would you come to my wedding?" I looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking at someone I loved. Just someone I used to know. "I came to remember," I said quietly. "To remember what it felt like to survive you." She blinked. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I continued. "You didn't want marriage with me. You weren't ready. And I believed you. But it turns out you were just saving yourself for someone else. And that's okay. But the least you could have done was let me go sooner." "Lewis," her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You poured water on me in front of my family and left me with nothing but silence. That was your choice." She stepped closer, the scent of her perfume hitting me like a memory. Familiar, sharp, unwanted. "I still think about you," she said. "There was a time I thought you'd be the one." "Yeah," I said. "There was a time I thought, that too." She looked like she wanted to say more, but the sound of someone calling her name interrupted the moment. Rick's voice. Calling for his wife. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me, a storm of something in her eyes. Regret, guilt, maybe even doubt. But it didn't matter anymore. I stepped back, took one last look at her and said, "Congratulations, Tomika. I hope he gives you everything I tried to." Then I turned, walked away, and didn't look back. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft streaks of orange and pink. I pulled out my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed since the night before. Kathleen. She picked, up on the second ring. "Hey." "Hey," I said, my voice lighter than it had felt in months. "Are you doing anything right now?" She laughed gently. "Not really. Why?" "Because I think I'm finally ready to go somewhere where I'm actually wanted." There was a pause. Then, soft as a promise, she said, "I'll be there in 10. As I slipped into my car, the last image I had of Tamika faded in the rearview mirror. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just with peace. Because I finally understood. She was never the destination. Just a detour on the way to someone who never made me beg to be chosen. 10 minutes later, she showed up exactly when she said she would. Kathleen pulled up in a silver hatchback, the one with the dent in the front bumper and a dream catcher swinging, from the rearview mirror. She stepped out, wearing jeans, a loose sweater, no makeup, hair in a lazy ponytail, and somehow She looked more beautiful than Tomeka did in a $3,000 dress. She saw the look on my face and tilted her head, smiling. Softly. "You're free now, huh?" I nodded. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like pretending. I actually felt it. Peace. It sat in my chest, not like a flame, but like a quiet warmth. We drove in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for filling. I didn't feel the need to explain, to relive it all, to dig back through the pain just to be understood. Kathleen already knew. She always had. We ended up at the pier, the one overlooking the water, with the rusted railing and the vendor who sells terrible hot dogs. We stood there, watching the city lights shimmer across the surface like broken stars trying to pull themselves together. "I saw her," Kathleen said finally. "She looked beautiful, but her eyes, they looked empty." I didn't say anything at first. Then, "I think she got everything she wanted." Kathleen shook her head. "No. She just lost everything she never valued. And the worst part, she'll realize it too late." There was something so calm about her. The way she spoke, the way she didn't try to force a silver lining. She didn't say, "You deserve better," or "She wasn't worth it." She didn't have to. Her presence said everything. "I didn't come to the wedding for her," I said. "I came to end it my way. No shouting, no revenge, just truth." Let her say her vows while knowing she never had mine. Kathleen looked at me, eyes shining in the low light. "Still, a part of you loved her." "Loved the idea of her," I replied. "The version of her I built in my head. But the real Tomeka? She buried that version every time she made me feel small and called it strength." She didn't answer. She just slid her hand into mine, and we stood there, fingers laced. Not as lovers, not yet, but as survivors of different storms, meeting in the quiet aftermath. Then, 3 days later, I got a message, a photo. It was Tomeka, at the airport, alone. Dress gone, makeup gone, bags at her feet, eyes wide, lost, no caption, just that image. Didn't reply, didn't ask questions. But I heard from someone later that Rick had disappeared the morning after the wedding. Apparently, his ex showed up at the reception, said she was pregnant, said he'd been seeing her the entire time. Rick had run. Left Tomeka behind, holding a bouquet in a room full of silence. She never saw it coming. Because people like her don't believe the tables can turn, and when they do, they look around and realize they burned every bridge on the way up. She reached out to me again a week after that. "Tomeka. Lewis, please, I need someone to talk to, just 5 minutes." I stared at the message for a long time. And then I replied, "Me. You had 3 years." She read it instantly. No response, just the dots that blinked and then disappeared. That was the last time I heard from her. But I wasn't done yet. A month later, I took the ring, the same one I had once thought was for her, and walked into the same rooftop garden I had reserved for our 3rd anniversary, but this time, it wasn't a dinner. It was a proposal. Kathleen stood there in a navy blue dress, simple, elegant, without a single trace of pretense. Her eyes met mine, not with nerves, not with doubt, but with quiet, steady love. I didn't get down on one knee. I didn't need to. I held her hand, placed the ring in her palm, and said, "I'm not asking you to complete me. I'm asking you to walk beside me with nothing to prove, except that we choose each other, freely." She smiled, the kind that went all the way to her soul, and whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes. We didn't throw a big wedding. Just family, close friends, and no surprises. But we did send out invitations, even to Tomeka. Not to be cruel, but to remind her that life moves on, with or without her." She didn't show. She wouldn't have. Dared. But I knew she saw the photos. I made sure they were posted on every platform she followed. Me in a black suit. Kathleen in a cream satin gown. Walking hand in hand into a life she never thought I'd find without her. That was my revenge. No shouting, no scandal, just a quiet, elegant victory. I didn't need to ruin her day. She did that all on her own. I just made sure she watched me live mine. Better, happier, loved, by someone who never made me beg to be wanted. And in the end, that was all the closure I needed, because nothing screams louder than the silence of someone who realizes they were never the main character in the story they thought they controlled. Now, every morning I wake up next to Kathleen, and she doesn't make promises she can't keep. She just keeps showing up in little ways that Tameka never could. A hot cup of coffee, a kiss on the shoulder, a simple, thank you for being here, and I finally know. This is what real love feels like. Not a chase, not a test, not a performance, just peace. And peace is the sweetest revenge of all.